Thank you, Claire, and thank you also for mentioning that I'm not a cyber expert, but come from agriculture. But this background allows me to also put some general, perhaps even easy questions to my distinguished panelists. Our setup here on the slide is not up to date. We have grown. We are now 6 panelists. And unfortunately, Deputy Minister Jarnecki couldn't come. I mean, given the circumstances, this is, of course, excused. But we are very happy to have Iryna Donets with us. She is her advisor on cyber and information, digital intelligence issues. So we start with a short presentation by Joseph Jarnecki here. He's from RUSI, and this panel is based on a study that you made on the approaches and mechanisms for cyber capability support, and you had a specific look at 2 cases that you analyzed. One is Ukraine, and that is the one we are discussing today. And the other one is Costa Rica. So, Joseph, you start, and then we bring in all the other panelists. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to have been invited here and for the papers have been accepted. Obviously, so today we're going to be discussing initially, for this initial 10 minutes anyway, about innovative approaches to international cyber support, particularly approaches and mechanisms for cyber capability support. So what is cyber capability support? Typically, international cyber support nowadays is understood as cyber capacity building. It's a broad term that encompasses many different activities. Given the growth in initiatives that we'll kind of discuss briefly in a second, and I'm sure as we go through the panel, myself and various other individuals have started to question the idea of whether or not there needs to be an expanded idea of how we understand international cyber support as separation within the field. Pursuant to that, here I elaborate an idea of cyber capability support as a policy area involving the direct provision of product, services, and other solutions, which will have immediate operational impacts advancing short to medium-term objectives. That contrasts and compares with cyber capacity building understood in a way which is more sustainable to create an endogenous capacity within recipients, i.e. you're not really giving or providing or paying for an ASM. You're not doing incident response services. You're constructing a SOC, you're helping to elaborate a cyber strategy. By contrast, with cyber capability support, you are indeed doing the things that are more about providing, doing, implementing. Interestingly, actually, I should contextualize that with 3 other attempts that have been made already to rationalize and conceptualize this area, just to kind of give due credit to them. So first is Cyber Defense Assistance, which was elaborated by Greg Rattray as part of the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative. Second is Cybersecurity Support Deployments, which SNV did a paper about last year, uniting CCB and what we're calling here CCS. And then finally also Deployed Cyber Defense, which was elaborated by Nick Beecroft wearing his BAE hat. So why is cyber capability support a thing? Why is it increasingly becoming a thing? I'm not going to go through all the details on this slide, but essentially there's been an uptick in large-scale or national-scale cyber incidents, particularly observable in 2022. So we've had Ukraine, Costa Rica, Albania, Montenegro, Vanuatu, all as distinct incidents where there has been a demand or a need, let's say, for rapid, ad hoc, immediate international cyber assistance. Various actors have been involved in that: US government, UK government, France, Estonia, Germany, Spain, we can go on, as well as large big tech companies. So Microsoft has been prominent across all of these responses, as well as then Google, AWS, Mandiant, and so on and so forth. Looking then at why we're doing the international cyber capability support and focusing on Ukraine as we will be doing in this session, it is certainly the case that government-led international cyber capability support, which we're focusing on with regards to the TALA mechanism and IT coalition, has been impactful. However, we should contextualize that in the context of Ukraine also having considerable efforts, or making considerable efforts in terms of its internal build-up with regards to governance, overhauls, to systems, rollout of cloud in advance of the invasion, that has been completely transformative in ensuring the cyber defense, as has been the private sector assistance in advance and throughout the invasion, which we can understand by other international mechanisms to provide cyber capability support, which aren't government-led. So this is the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative mentioned earlier. Nonetheless, the Tallinn Mechanism and IT Coalition announced last year have done some impressive things. So contextualizing this a little bit more broadly, what are other mechanisms that are being established? In the paper that's in the final paper in the hardback, which is a very nice hardback, I outline around 10 distinct mechanisms. Here I'm just going to go quickly through 6. So there's the IT Coalition and Tallinn Mechanism, both 10-country initiatives, but with different countries, which is slightly tricky to remember. The IT Coalition primarily focused on military activities or has a military focus, and the Tallinn Mechanism civilian. All of this obviously is open source information. I defer to experts on the panel in terms of their precise ability to say how and where I'm wrong. Then there's another initiative that was recently launched by the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. I use this as an example of a mechanism because it's relatively new first, but then it also has an interesting point around remit. So rather than being a broad initiative, as we'll see in the next slide, or an initiative just focused on an active and live crisis, as in the case of the IT Coalition and Tallinn Mechanism in Ukraine, Cyber Rapid instead looks at specific incidents and disasters and responding to those. Relatively impressive startup costs, but pales in comparison when we think about the several hundreds of millions that certain tech companies say they've expended already in Ukraine. One final point before I move on to the next slide. The IT Coalition particularly is very interesting in comparison to other mechanisms because it has an end point. Most other mechanisms, and you can understand this if you're looking to signal to an adversary your resolute determination to stay in for the long game, don't have endpoints. There's not really a threshold for withdrawal because you don't want to provide an incentive for continued hostility, whereas the IT Coalition has this 6-year commitment to deliver secure and resilient IT infrastructure. Obviously, that's probably more so linked to the idea of developing sustainable endogenous capacity. However, it's an important reflection. And another point I should mention is that both the IT Coalition and Tallinn Mechanism seem to be hybrids of cyber capability support type initiatives, which I've discussed, as well as the more traditional, let's say, cyber capacity building. Next, then, just quickly highlighting a few more interesting mechanisms that are being spun up. We have the European Political Community's Cyber Reserve, which is being identified as something that should go ahead under the EU Solidarity Act. Under this, the assumption is private IR services would be deployable on the request of members. This is a very reactive mechanism, as would be the virtual cyber incident support capability that NATO has proposed. However, we're yet to see further details on how or if these will proceed. Another point of reflection is on how some countries are trying to make these types of mechanisms cohesive and comprehensive as part of broader international cyber support activities, particularly the US with the Cyberspace and Digital Technology Fund, announced and pioneered by Nate Fick. It has a substantial amount of funding, but has diverse objective sets. So it doesn't just look to respond reactively to cyber crises that appear in order to mitigate or resolve them. It also looks to have this longer term sustainable impact, trying to tie the whole piece together. That leads me to some key challenges and recommendations taken through the research. First, the 3 challenges identified are alignment, monitoring and measuring, and enabling and creating an enabling environment for a cyber capability support mechanism. If we're thinking about alignment, the instinctive approach is to have a preoccupation with deconfliction. We just really don't want to do the same things. This is valuable. This is also more difficult if we think about the diversity of actors, big tech being involved. Nonetheless, if we're looking to expand a tapestry with multiple cyber security or cyber capability support mechanisms internationally, a degree of strategic overlap can ensure that potentially, if there is a case that one mechanism is overloaded, another one can pick up the slack, so to speak. Second, in terms of alignment, a desire for cohesion is understandable. We want to cooperate on these activities. We want to have economies of scale. We want to have a joint lift to both legitimize and drive these forward together. But at the same time, when you have a large cooperative entity trying to do something, you have diverging priorities, which can be an obstacle to rapid response, for example. So Taylor Grossman has a good piece last year criticizing this specifically with regards to the EU's cyber rapid response teams and saying, have they actually been able to be rapid, given the limitations of having to deconflict diverse priorities? Monitoring and measuring is a pretty intuitive challenge that I'm sure many of us are all aware of in here. You need to be able to justify, you need to be able to present a value case. This is quite difficult if we're combining both development priorities and security priorities, not to mention influence and commercial. Having a clarity of purpose can be useful, particularly if we're looking for speed. A skepticism that's been expressed to me in conversations with some officials is around moral hazard. So if we're establishing these kind of mechanisms, are we not just incentivizing an absence of investment in cybersecurity? I personally don't think that argument is very strong. There are other costs involved in a cybersecurity attack than just having to pay an instant responder. Nonetheless, it's a concern. And then the idea of formalizing these mechanisms, through formalization, do we unfortunately create an incentive for adversaries to identify the thresholds for deployment and manipulate and utilize them to try and trigger this as frequently as possible to increase the cost. So if I say that if you drop a piece of paper on the ground, I'm going to come and hit you, and you do it all over the room, I'm going to be walking around a lot. The challenge and response point relates to the unique opportunity, nonetheless, that does exist for cyber capability support to be assessed. There are relatively data-rich activities that can be conducted when we're thinking about the provision of services or products, obviously dependent on telemetry collection in some cases, which is a complex question which we can get into, though nonetheless we have the persistent issues around assessing qualitatively whether or not adversaries are deterred, whether or not denial does happen. It's hard to establish what the quality was if we didn't have an accurate original baseline, for example. Finally, then, in terms of challenges, it's tricky to put together an enabling environment. Governments do not have enough capabilities to provide this kind of assistance at scale or in many different places at once. As such, there is a need to use the private sector, but the private sector is also already doing it themselves in some cases. Understanding when, why, how we, or governments, I should say, engage with the private sector is a very important question. Finally, then, and this is a point I tried to tease out a little bit in the paper, but I'm slightly unsure of and would appreciate any thoughts from fellow panelists or the audience, is this legitimate? Is this just? Is this in alignment with international law? Not just the idea of the provision of assistance or the reception of assistance, but also the involvement of private sector actors unilaterally. For example, CDAC as an entity is strange, historically speaking, that private companies get together to provide international cyber capability support or international force support to another nation in this way. Consolidating all of that, and conscious I've probably overrun a little bit, can only apologize for taking up excessive amounts of our time, are three recommendations that follow from this. So first, that we need a measurable strategic value case. It's really tempting, particularly for entities that might have diverse organizational priorities, to try to do everything at once. You know, it's like the movie, everything everywhere all at once. We want to do development, we want to do security, we want to do influence, we want to do commercial. That's really difficult, and it makes it much more exhausting and arduous to first identify the activities we should be pursuing, as well as then to assess whether or not they've been successful. Second, the recommendation is if you want to do this in a mechanism mechanism way that's multilateral, it has to be multi-stakeholder. You can't scale effectively that level of activity, I don't think, without private sector involvement. However, you don't have to do that the same way all the time. Engaging with the private sector can sometimes be the private sector as a core partner, like the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise. They are equal partners, more or less, in a sense, with states, but that doesn't have to be the case. They can just be deployment functions. It can just be the case if you pay them for a service. Finally, is taking a comprehensive approach to international cyber support. I appreciate I might have expressed some skepticism around cyber capability building, or might have seemed to. If that's not the case, I think that they're all crucially important, which just we need a comprehensive approach to this across the trajectory of engagement. And I'll leave it there. Thank you,
Joe. Here are 2 free seats in the front row. If somebody would like to take a seat, there is more space. Is there another one? 3 free seats here in the front row. Catherine, would you like to come? Okay, so thank you for these introductions, which gives us also a little bit of a theoretical, but also kind of category framework for what we're discussing now. I would like to start with Iryna. Iryna Donets is, as I said, the advisor to the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine for digital transformation, digital development, and digitalization. So Ukraine is a highly digitized country and society, and also your economic model for the future is built on the digital transition. Please give us a little bit of insight. What happened in 2022? How did you assess the damage done by the cyber dimension of the Russian invasion into Ukraine? And what did you do to respond to this threat?
First of all, of course, for every Ukrainian, the war did not start in 2022. It started in 2014. So we have been experiencing elements of cyber war since then. But of course, in 2022, it has become much more large scale. So for us, of course, the impact was huge, both in terms of disrupting our strategic communication lines, targeting our critical infrastructure, etc. So although, as you said, Ukraine is a highly digitized nation and is definitely striving toward that, we have lots of support from our NGOs, civil society, Ukrainian industry, who are even providing a lot of support on a volunteer basis to the defense sector and the civilian sector. We have seen the requirements of such scale that we clearly understood that we cannot do this alone. And more importantly, while a lot of support has been offered initially, also from industry, internationally, nationally, also from government stakeholders, there, at some point we understood that while we had this putting out fires period where we just need to do rapid decisions, quick fixes, and everyone was resolved to do as much as they can. Quickly, we realized that, of course, we need more sustainability towards the support that is being provided, both in terms of more planned, more scheduled support from our partners, but also sustainability in terms of requirements on our end. We cannot ask for things that we need tomorrow or needed yesterday. We need a more planned approach to that. And that's why, of course, we try to come up with different frameworks for how we could coordinate all of this assistance and have one voice from the Ukrainian side on where the priorities are, so that our international partners are not approached through 10 different angles or entities at the same time. And also, on the other hand, our partners have a platform where they could communicate what sort of assistance they're ready to provide, so that it is put to the best use possible. So, of course, over time, we realized that initiatives like IT Coalition and Tallinn mechanism are essential, because the war and the power of Russia is not going to diminish immediately. And we need to start working together, building an ecosystem of partnerships and see where we could build synergies and build on each other's experience, knowledge, and prior indeed experience of Russian attacks or potential future threats, also not only in Ukraine but in Europe overall.
Mm-hmm. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on the kind of threat or damage that you experienced? So it was government entities, it was critical infrastructure. It's also, for private citizens something happened. Can you describe this a little bit more in detail?
Yes, indeed. Of course, the span of impact is huge. We, of course, probably many of you heard of the attacks on the, for instance, Kyivstar cell network, which was, impact for every citizen in Ukraine, where you couldn't get hold of anyone for a couple of days. And of course, our, Russians continue to attack our government networks, trying to access our information all the time. It's an ongoing issue, and we expect it to be a continuous threat. And the same happens, of course, with more on the civilian side, where we see critical infrastructure facilities being impacted, and also our industries that provide critical services for the civilian population. So it's, the span is huge, and only, by uniting also efforts in Ukraine, where government entities need to support civilians, and on the other hand, only this sort of ecosystem work could stand against Russia in this case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's move on to Tanel Sepp. He is my distinguished colleague as a cyber ambassador. His title is Ambassador at Large for Cyber Diplomacy for Estonia. We meet approximately every second week because we are part of the traveling cyber circus. But Tanel has also an important role to play because the front office of the Tallinn mechanism, so the civilian cyber support for Ukraine, is actually led by Estonia. So please, Tanel, explain us a little bit what the Tallinn mechanism is, how it works, and what Estonia's role in it is.
Thank you so much. And let me just start with one kind of on a lighter note. When I was a small kid, then I sang in different choirs like a true Estonian. So we were really happy when there were more people in the audience than the choir had the singers. So by this margin, this discussion is already a success. In 2022, when the full-scale war now started, then we were all facing this kind of chaotic situation. We all wanted to help Ukraine in all different fields. And also, when I attended our crisis meetings, then I tried to give more information on what was happening in cyberspace. And I also, there are some anecdotes even on different phone conversations or conferences on what should we do now, how should we help Ukraine. I think these are still under a certain classification. Maybe in some years we can reveal these stories, these war stories. But what all these donors were willing to help faced was that we got different lists of equipment or services that Ukraine needed. Sometimes we got even different lists at the same day. So nobody was really convinced. What is the priority need? Where should we focus our assistance? So later on, in February 23, it was actually the German Foreign Ministry that convened the first meeting of donors in Brussels, along with NATO and EU and Ukrainian representatives, to really discuss how to structure this donor cooperation. And then we followed this up here in Tallinn just last year, in the margins of CyCon also. So CyCon has a critical role here. And then we met in London, and now recently in The Hague, and next week we'll be in Geneva. But what we really figured out was that we kind of devised a 3-level coordination mechanism. So we have this overall coordination between 10 countries and Ukraine, and we meet really to discuss more principal questions and to try to figure out some bottlenecks. Then we have back office in Poland, and we'll hear about that very soon. That's kind of consolidating different opportunities from donor side and the requests from Ukrainians. And then the front office in Kiev that we are manning. I think that the front office part is quite interesting here because initially we didn't think about sending anybody to Kiev, but we understood immediately that if you want to assist a country, you need to be locally present. You need to go there and talk to people, make sure that you're doing the right thing. And also to make sure that Ukrainians were doing their homework or whatever we agreed to have been done. So right now we're in a situation where, at least on this telemechanism or the civilian side, Ukraine has created its own coordination mechanism led by Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov. It has all different ministries, agencies engaged there. And this is the body that really goes through all the different requirements that Ukraine has and prioritizes this. So that we, in telemechanism, we get the priority requirements that then the donors can act upon.
Thank you, Tanel. Now we move on to our Polish colleague, Adam Szczukocki. He trained me before, but I don't manage it. Too many Z's and Z's and so on.
Yeah.
So Adam, you're here because Poland plays also a critical role in the Tallinn mechanism because, I mean, basically every hardware component of the support goes through Poland, and Poland is heading the back office or the back end of the Tallinn mechanism. So can you explain a little bit how you see it also as a neighboring country, how you see the threat, and what is your contribution to this kind of capability support?
So, first of all, the safety of Ukraine, the peace in Ukraine is crucial to Poland. And since the beginning of the full-scale war, we started to help. And in many aspects, and cybersecurity is one of them, which appeared to be very, very important. I don't know the exact year, but I think it was closer to the start of the war. We provided around 20,000 Starlink logins, and we wanted to support Ukraine as much as we can. Now, Poland is the back office of Tallinn mechanism, and our main job is to collect a list of equipment, of systems that Ukraine needs, and then provide this information around the mechanism and also engage private sector. Just today, we in Warsaw have 2 meetings with American companies from cybersecurity, and I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We now look at, the Tallinn mechanism is for civilian cyber support, but there is also, of course, a need for military cyber support as, all military forces in the world rely now on some or more digital components. So my distinguished colleague, Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, former cyber ambassador for Estonia, former chair of the Digital Society Institute in Berlin, is now, and I look up your title, the chair of the steering group of UDCG and the IT coalition for the Estonian Ministry of Defense. Please explain to us what are the specificities of the IT coalition, and what is it actually that you provide for Ukraine? How do you procure this, and what is your initial assessment of how this works.
Thank you. And it's really good to see so many people here interested in Ukraine. And I'm very glad that we can discuss that also with the civil society and private sector in the room now. The IT coalition is one of the capability coalitions under the Rammstein format, which was set up when the war, second phase of the war in 22 started with the full-scale invasion. And the Rammstein format has many capabilities, defense capabilities. I think it's 15 coalitions now. There is one for artillery, one for tanks, one for F-16s. So there are plenty of those defense formats. Each of those Rammstein formats has its own kind of logic, has a lead nation or a couple of lead nations, and also is gathering a different set of experts and communities within the defense ministries and armed forces of mostly NATO nations and, of course, Ukraine. So the IT coalition was brought into being, realizing that we need to also help Ukraine with the digital technologies, cyber defense, and other software and hardware needs for fighting the war properly. In the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, where Iryna is working, and in the armed forces are different centers and structures which are dealing with technological superiority in the battlefield. Probably you have heard about Delta system, which is the platform that helps to understand the movements of troops on the ground, and also target and defend the Ukrainian forces and attack the Russian forces. So this is a very elaborate technological system where you have many components. There are sensors, satellite pictures. There are also, of course, drones and all the other capabilities are joined up there. So this kind of battlefield superiority that we are trying to achieve with helping Ukrainian forces then to have that kind of technological dominance and make sure that they know what happens on the other side and they can protect themselves better. So this is, I think, a immediate kind of war time capability related activity what we are doing with the IT coalition. Of course, there is also the mid-term and longer-term perspective what we are doing. We are also helping Ukraine to build up the secure IT systems for longer run, which is also linked up with the future force and all the other future planning of the Ukrainian armed forces. And there are many requirements when the country is fighting the war. There is logistics requirement. Logistics is very important. So Napoleon lost because of logistics didn't work. And hopefully French are not offended in the room. But logistics, medical support for the troops, all the different small requirements that you need to quickly, actually, very efficiently, to put up when you are fighting the war. So we are helping those technological and digital capabilities to do that. Plus, of course, cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is maybe one of the facets, just. It's a much broader requirement what we are fulfilling with the IT coalition, where certainly cybersecurity has important role, but it goes beyond cyber. And also what we are exactly doing, we are, procuring software and hardware and services. How we are doing this? We are using the NATO support and procurement agency that is situated in Luxembourg, and Estonia and Luxembourg are the co-leads of the IT coalition. So, and of course, Ukraine is our also co-lead here, but they are co-leads in all Rammstein coalition capability formats. We have roughly 12 nations now joined, and in addition to this kind of shopping list of software and hardware that we are urgently now trying to fulfill in 2024, we also have set up working groups that help the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces to develop those capabilities in the future. So, and NATO nations then all joining up with Ukraine. And also, this is the way how the NATO nations and all the other Ramstein capability coalition members can also learn from Ukrainian experience. So it's kind of the good way of making sure that we also are better prepared if something was to happen on NATO territory.
Okay, thank you. Luke Champion is the head of the UK Integrated Security Fund's Ukraine Cyber Program in the FCDO in London. And at least for us in Germany, this cyber program is kind of the benchmark how to do and how much to spend on cyber capacity building. So, and you established it also already quite a while ago. So I would like to ask you, from a major donor's perspective, how do you, so explain us a little bit how this funding and also the strategic planning with it, how you set this up. And then also you're engaged in both mechanisms, the Tallinn mechanism and the IT coalition. How you see these two mechanisms, do they help you in deploying your support?
Yeah, thanks, Regine. Well, maybe by way of a bit of background, to date we've spent about £15 million since the start of the war. And to answer the first part of your question, how do we do it? A lot of panicking, spinning something up that large. It's very difficult, but the willingness in UK government and in industry was massive. So we had a lot of partners who wanted to do something, wanted to work together. And as Tanel says, and I think other panels have said similar things, there were relationships in Ukraine already to benefit from. People who'd been engaging with teams like Iryna's. And we were able to leverage some of those to find projects that were really achieving and flex some of our procurement styles. So we partnered with Mandiant very early on in the war to put out some of the fires that Iryna mentioned, and we were really pleased to do that. As you say, I was there at the founding of the Tallinn mechanism with Tanel. John from Germany called me up and said, we're forming the Avengers. We want you to be part of the team. I was very honored. But it's been a really great tool for us so far. We've had 2 big partnerships through it. We've received funding from USAID, but we've also received funding from Denmark as well to do some joint projects. So it's really come together for us and been very, very valuable to discuss lots of things. And I'll come on to some of the opportunities it's created. We've also spearheaded the contribution of the UK to the IT coalition. We did a 1.4 million package of support to the MOD, which we were really pleased to do. So we've been very involved in both and found them extremely useful. To be more specific on that, I think some of our guests might be a bit question why they turned up for a panel about donor coordination, when I say the biggest benefit of a donor coordination group is coordination. But I'll nuance that and say it's really the triage that we receive from it. Tanel, you referenced it as well. We were in that position where we were receiving lists day after day of things we think we might need. We could do this, we could apply this really well. Lots of different voices putting into those. And what both of these mechanisms have done really helpfully is create a place and a forum to discuss those needs with each other and say, who are the serious donors who might be able to do something about this, and start formulating ideas of the how on a priority that's very clearly given with strategic direction, as Iryna nodded to. I think the other part to that as well then is it makes us bigger than the sum of our parts, which is an extremely useful thing. From my perspective, we all have different strategies and we all are licensed to do different things. We come with different buckets of money. And what these groups allow us to do is discuss and say, hey, my money is really, really good at doing these things. Your money is really, really good at doing those things. If we work together, we can sell it to our leadership, honestly, that we are helping them do their work over here and allowing them to do as much of that as they want, not tread on our toes and vice versa. So we're doing more for Ukraine by working together than we would have as individuals. I also agree with Iryna. I think the one voice is a really, really important thing here. It's really great for us as 10 nations to provide a message to Ukraine about how we think we can help them and create that one fora there. And it allows us to harden that message sometimes we need to and say, well, we need some support here. We need you guys to be slightly faster at this, or actually, this doesn't matter too much to us as a group of 10 and pass on that message. And I think the final one, my top 4, there are many more, but my top 4, I think learning's the big one here. I think an element of this today, we're here to talk about Ukraine mainly, but we're learning how to do this better in future cyber conflicts as well. We're getting a group of willing partners together that are likely to be allies in the future. And that has a lot of value. And we're reading each other's strategies, we're looking at each other's work, we're gaining an understanding of how we operate better. And that's really, really valuable. So we're really pleased to be part of both of these mechanisms and be contributing to them.
Thank you, Luke, and also thank you for letting us have a look into your, inside cuisine somehow. By way of anecdote, I can also tell you panicking plays also a big role in our system. And some of you will know this, but in my team, for example, the person responsible for actually signing the check is the most junior person on the team. So she's our budget expert. And she came to me, I think it was in 2023 in the beginning, and said, it was on the 10th of January, I just spent 10 million euros, just by signing on off one project. So I think this is really something where you also have to prepare your system for this kind of emergency support, because later, Court of Auditors will come for certain and check if you complied with all the rules, even in times of crisis.
I fear that day every day, Regine.
Okay, so now we have understood how this works. I would like to come back to you, Joseph. Some of your questions that you raised in your presentation in the beginning were added. You got some were answered. You got some additional information of how this works in practice and what motivation of both donors and recipients is. You call this this concept, you call it capability support. So what I would like to know is, do you see, or where do you see a difference between the more traditional cyber capacity building and capability support, which includes, as I understand, also emergency support? And where do you see, the differences, but also, let's say, the mechanisms that don't work for capability support, but are to be overcome when you come from a background of capacity building, both as a donor and as a recipient?
Those are really good questions. I think that trying to frame the difference between the two, the way I feel you can do it is in a quadrant around two key ideas. So there's a way of framing the difference with regards to activities, and there's a way of framing the difference with regards to impact objectives. So I think in terms of activities, cyber capacity building should really not involve intuitively, or anyway, if you think about it in a development approach, shouldn't involve a lot of purchasing for a recipient. It shouldn't involve a lot of direct provision. It should be about curating an environment in which endogenous capacity can be built such that things can be done by the recipient themselves going forward. So if you think about it in terms of activities, there's a difference there. Another way we can think about the difference, I think, is in terms of the impact objectives. So capability support is probably not as useful in terms of achieving longer term impacts. You're not going to be thinking about developing a peer-to-peer relationship with a recipient country by providing them an attack surface monitoring piece of software. It's not going to help you on your journey in that way. By contrast, cyber capacity building has a inbuilt assumption and a desire to build a sustainable long-term activity to achieve these kind of medium to long-term objectives. So in the objective sense, then we also have the difference between short to medium-term capability, focusing on immediate operational impact. So in the context of Costa Rica, large-scale ransomware attack, a strong need for software solutions to that which exist. Spain leveraged an existing relationship which it had with Costa Rica in order to, and this will get to the challenges, channel through that software solution. That's not cyber capacity building, though. That's not helping in the longer term. That's just fixing an immediate operational concern. Then the second point you raise around the difficulty of adopting cyber capability type activities when you're used to doing cyber capacity support is really important. And I think it relates exactly to the story of your colleague saying, my God, I've spent 10 million, because there are so many exceptionally good processes in place to ensure that cyber capacity building money is spent well, that it's procured openly, so there's free and fair competition between different providers, and that it's best calibrated for the situation. So there's kind of rounds of analysis, you invite various bids, and that could take, I don't know, 8 months maybe at the longest if we're USAID, say anything. Or 3 to 4 months, let's say. By contrast, if we're trying to do cyber capability support and there's no immediate operational need, we're trying to fix the fires, we're trying to, let's say, deploy instant response, you can't have that long of a process. And so you need to put in place systems that allow you to access those kind of providers. That could, for example, be setting up assured supplier agreements. So a national technical authority in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, could assign companies as trusted providers of incident response that could be on a limited list, that could be requested when there's a desire to provide international cyber capability support. There could be a retainer agreement for a company to provide a 24/7 response in certain contexts. There could be contracting mechanisms used in order to otherwise directly purchase, taken and inspired by the military and how they do it. So there's some interesting obstacles for sure in tackling the two, and I think the main challenge that I've encountered so far, but would defer to people that actually have to deal with the issue, like yourself and others on the panel, is how we're going to solve the procurement question given the difference in speed required and the difference in impact intended.
Thank you. Iryna, seen from the outside, I have the impression that Ukraine moved from an emergency crisis panic type of mindset, approaching international partners, to a more midterm, long-term perspective in what kind of international cooperation you would like to have with partners. So can you describe a little bit, is this a correct observation, and how do you now today use the support mechanisms with regard to also post-war perspective of Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I would say that's a correct observation. Of course, the war is still ongoing, and the operational tempo is quite high, so we'll still see some urgent requirements that needs to be addressed quickly. So I would say still emergency sort of response, procurement procedures and support provision mechanisms still need to be in place, and I would encourage to even continue improving them, learning the lessons of the initial support that was provided. But when we initiated the IT coalition together with Luxembourg and Estonia almost a year ago, we understood that, first of all, let's start with the fact that IT and cyber is very difficult to sell to politicians overall. It's very difficult to get them to get across that sense of how it impacts the battlefield, or how it impacts the other war-fighting capabilities. And even internally, I would say that is an internal battle within, our MOD to spend more funding on IT versus other requirements. And when we initiated this, there wasn't, a queue of nations who were willing to throw money at us or equipment and everything. So we understood that the approach should be very different. We should think in terms of impact, in terms of the capabilities that it will provide, and more in a project-based approach, so that nations can clearly see how their support will be utilized and what the longer-term impact will be. and for many nations, it was also important to understand how Ukraine could take ownership at some point on some of these capabilities. So we can request, a spaceship, but we won't be able to maintain it probably after the war ends. So it was very important to set realistic goals even internally. Of course, we are quite lucky at the moment because we have quite a lot of experienced people mobilized in the armed force with IT, with cyber background, but we understand that they won't stay when the war ends, and we need to ensure that, again, the support has this sustainability factored in. So indeed, we moved, I hope, from the shopping lists to more clearly defined projects or capabilities that are required. And I hope we'll just continue improving and being better at this, because I think being transparency and openness with partners is also one of the key factors here for Ukraine to continue and maintain this level of support that we have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to come now to a very important point, and that is the inclusion of the private sector. Perhaps, Iryna, you can start with explaining how you work with private sector companies. I mean, they played a crucial role in the resilience of Ukraine in the beginning of 2022, and since. Can you explain a little bit how you work with them? Mm-hmm. What are you, let's say, the critical questions that you also put on their tables? Mm-hmm. And please.
So I would say that speaking from the military standpoint, from MOD side, that's a bit different to all the other government agencies, because of course in military domains there are sensitivities of engaging civilian sector because of the sensitivity of information. Personnel needed to be cleared for any sort of more closer engagement. But of course, initially when the war started, we had lots of support provided free of charge from industry. For instance, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but also the risks and the actual impacts of physical destruction of some of the infrastructure forced us to move many of the services in the cloud, and that's where industry was very supportive and very critical and ensured resiliency of our services for end users. And I think industry also saw that Ukraine is a perfect area where they could test their technology, have that immediate feedback to improve their solutions. So we saw it again as a mutually beneficial partnership. But of course, industry always has, profit factors in mind. So you cannot expect that this is something that will be maintained in the longer term. So, third year of the full-scale war, we see fewer and fewer companies who are ready to maintain that sort of level of free of charge support and asking us to find international partners to fund their services. Additionally, many of our industry partners also have their internal reservations on specifically contributing to defense area. So they are more flexible with working with the civilian side. But if we are talking operations and contributing to combat activities, some of them, they have corporate policies in place that prevent them from doing that. So I would say we try to be as flexible as possible in engaging that support. But what we clearly understand that only in partnership with our government partners and industry, we could move into a more sustainable approach to support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Adam, I would like to ask you, because you mentioned it also in your initial statement, how you work with private sector. I mean, for example, when my name appeared on the RSA program in San Francisco a month ago, my inbox was immediately flooded with offers of tech guys wanting to have a chat with me. So I think there is a huge interest also from private sector to kind of be part of of the package that is offered to Ukraine. So how do you deal with this situation, and what are the criteria that you use to make the selections of partners you actually then work with?
Iryna already said that and revealed our strategy because really it is. I think that private sector in general do not understand that all they are pretending that they do not understand that is the best opportunity to test their software, their hardware, and yeah, that is our main strategy. But they can count on fast feedback, they can count on improvements, something like this. But the negotiations with private sector is complicated because I think, that's my guess, that, as I've said, they pretend they do not understand this, that this is the best opportunity to test their products. So yeah, that we are focusing on this. The negotiations are ongoing, as I've said, just today. We have meetings with 2 American companies, and well, it's ongoing. Yeah.
Tanel, I would like to ask you, because I saw you nodding, but also I think, I mean, it is a difficult decision who to take on board and make this also vetting of personnel that you let look into your systems. So what is your experience, what is your lessons learned of how to work best with private sector in times of crisis?
First of all, I do believe that the present war in Ukraine has changed the whole landscape in terms of engagement with the private sector. And if you look at the role of private sector, really directly assisting a foreign government, migrating or storing sovereign data, our intel services are more and more dependent on the information of these big companies, then that creates expectations. So I do believe that in the right time, somewhere in hopefully near future, we will start talking about these expectations, because I don't think this will be the only war that we're seeing in our lifetimes. Now, in terms of talking to the industry, I mean, I have done my outreach. I've extensively talked to CDAC, the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative. I've talked to CRDF guys, and I see some also here in this room. We've been quite open in saying that, hey, we are dealing basically with a whole Ukrainian digital society, minus defense. This is a lot. So there are possibilities for everyone in the end. And now why telemechanism for me is so important is that this gives kind of framework really to see who gets what bit. Because in the end, us, the governments, we give the money, yes, but we cannot implement the projects. At the same time, we cannot let also only the private sector do the job, because what we are trying to do is really build up systems for Ukrainian governments. But that knowledge, what is really feasible for government services, is not only, I mean, there's a lot of information is held by the private sector, but some of the information or the skills and experience, it's in the government sector. So we really have to combine this and to make sure that we have a sound, agile, and a fair system. Because, I mean, we cannot wait for too long, because the requirements are for now. Of course, we're also looking in the medium and long term, but we need Ukraine to win the war right now.
Luke, I think one of the things that is very important also with regard to cooperation with the private sector is the threat assessment itself. And UK has built a very high degree of professional intimacy between private sector, so IT security service providers and government. What do you think is the, let's say, the key factor for success in this kind of cooperation between the two sides?
That's a good question.
Or I put it perhaps differently. When we look at capability support and more long-term capacity building, what should we aim at? Should we aim at full-scale, full-fledged competencies and capabilities on the government side, or can we also envisage a certain distribution of roles between public and private sector in the future?
I think for our part when doing this program and using that as my kind of mini example for where I think it goes well, is how do you bring the private sector and Ukraine into all stages of the program cycle? So really importantly, design. Traditionally, and what I found in capacity building when I used to do it on cyber, was we would burrow ourselves away, not want to let industry in the room, not to be sold something we might not want. We were concerned that they might, cook solutions up and lead us down a path, and we'd get in trouble in our audit to come later that we spoke to one person, not others. But there are actually very effective ways you can engage industry partners through consultation in that design. And also Ukraine, I was out there just last week talking and saying, we're going to be bidding for more money next year. What would you like us to spend it on? That's what these groups and coalitions are so good at. So from my perspective, how do you get people in the room early on design? And again, with industry, these networks already exist. They're quite diffuse, but a lot of in the UK, the industry providers, they're people from ex-government, they're ex-NCSC. So it's very easy to get this network of people that we're confident in, that we trust, but also understand how we operate and what our vision is. So I think that's really important. I think in mobilization as well, again, we like to tell someone you're going to have a scoping period and we want to be satisfied with everything you do, and this is who you're going to talk to. And what we found actually is ask them, make use of their network. A lot of these companies have native Ukrainian speakers from the Ukrainian government previously. That's been really, really helpful. They've got their own relationships and products already deployed in some of these. So I think that's another way where you can use that trio of our groups where they kind of, I don't know if anyone ever engineered the roles, but there's this kind of diffuse network coming together. I think in delivery as well, I think it's asking those groups, how do you want us to do this? Don't let us burrow away in a room. How do you want us to do this? So industry partner, what are you really good at? What are you really confident in? It's going to go really well. Okay, we'll do a lot of that. Ukraine, what do you really want and need? And who's got capacity to work with us right now? Don't burrow in and say, well, we've spoken to this researcher and they say these are the best 3 things to do. So we're going to do 33%, 33%, 33%. That doesn't work either. And then finally, I think on the kind of closure part of our program cycle, that 4-part program cycle, we're not very good, especially here, as Joe said, at monitoring the effectiveness of some of the things we're doing. A sort of small example of that is on instant response. How do we say how many attacks we're happy with responding to? And bearing in mind, each response is different. Sometimes we're responding to a wiper attack. The wiper did what it wanted to do. We might just restore the network faster. Other times, we're taking espionage where off in less than 24 hours, so it did some damage, but not a lot. One's a major success, one's still a success, but not as good. So it's very hard to say, well, was that a success? We did 200 of them. Oh, that's really good. Oh no, I got the number wrong. It was 1,000. Are you really happy now because I said 200 first? Or is 1,000 a really good result? It's very hard to work out. So again, we need to sit down with a network, that trio of people, and say, Ukraine, did you think this was good? Qualitatively, did you think this was good? Industry, you've responded to all kinds of events across the world. Did you think this was good? And try to build that picture together. And one day maybe we'll have a baseline for future conflict, but not now. So I think that's how that trio works together. I don't want to say it's so engineered, though. I think sometimes those diffuse networks that just work together, that's how it comes together.
Tanel, please.
Sorry to come back, but I wanted to insert one other quite critical point. Whenever I've been talking to Estonian companies, and our companies have been also in Ukraine for quite some time, and I've been telling them about telemechanism and how it works. One of the critical points here is that we're not just the telemechanism is not just about the Western companies or the North American big tech. It has to be a partnership with Ukrainian companies, because in the end, our goal is also to strengthen the market in Ukraine, so that it's more sustainable.
I'll add to that as well. That's something, again, it was conversations with people like yourself at the telemechanism that made us put that in our bids. So when we're putting out contracts for people to fill, we're saying you need to have a local Ukrainian partner who can go there and be interpreted. So we've partnered with Oktava Defense in Ukraine. We're really pleased to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Heli, when it comes to military cyber support, there is, I think, a very crucial question about digital sovereignty. So in terms of, actually the tools that you use within the IT coalition, but also with the long-term perspective of what you build on the Ukrainian side. So how do you see this challenge of maintaining or achieving digital sovereignty?
Well, let's also stress again that IT coalition is not just about cyber, but is building the long-term IT infrastructure for the Ukrainian MOD and armed forces, which is much bigger task in a way, because we have to make sure that we do it right. So, and also we should start, of course, with urgent capabilities, which we already have done. In this year, we try to basically just buy off-the-shelf hardware and software, because this is what is needed in this juncture of war. But for the future, I think the picture will be very interesting how we are going to choose specific products, because all of the products are provided by the private sector. It's a dual-use domain. So there is no military kind of data server purposed only for military. You buy the dual-use and you combine with your systems. The only things, of course, that have the actual military application are the IT systems that are coming together with the weapons. So, and one of the tasks that, for instance, we right now have is that different countries are donating different weapon systems, but these are not often or not always linked up when it comes to the command and control. So somebody has to do that unifying work, linking it all up with the Ukrainian command and control. And it's a lot of brain power and effort that goes there. And the digital sovereignty question, well, as an Estonian who was experiencing the cyber attacks 2007 and so on, I would think, is there a possibility for sovereignty in cyberspace? Is a very philosophical question. And maybe we should have another panel on this. So, coming back to Ukraine, it's going to be interesting how we are cooperating with the private sector in the future, because certainly we need to have a very good private sector know-how developing new software, for instance, for those new systems that we are building. Most of this is done now by Ukrainian teams. So we are providing basically support what we can in the format of the dual-use technology. But I guess the Ukrainian teams on the ground actually employed by the MOD and armed forces are the ones that are right now building this very state-of-art, totally groundbreaking solutions there. But what happens in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, let's see. Let's have another panel then.
Okay. I will now put the last round of questions to the panelists, and then it's your turn. So please prepare for firing a question to our panelists. My last questions are around the lessons learned or the takeaways, because well, I'm a diplomat, and I'm convinced that diplomacy is not only about teaching other people what to do, but also learning from other people what to do. And in this sense, we understand our capacity building and capability support also as a two-way street, in the sense that we engage with Ukraine in this case, but it's also for our own benefit. So it's not only spending money, but it's also about improving our own situation. So I will ask everybody on the panel, and starting with Luke and then down here to Joe, to name one lesson learned or takeaway that you took from the experience battalion mechanism IT coalition for your own benefit, for your own system?
That's challenging. I wrote down 5 on my notepad here, so you're making me pick, but that's okay. I do think I have a top one, though, which was, I reference panic as something of a joke, but there is quite a lot of truth in it. The war started, and we had 3 days to put together a program and launch something that made sense and spend money in support of Ukraine and do work that was valuable. And I think I'd fail in my role if the next person in the next conflict had the same experience as me. Joe referenced it earlier. We need to get better at, or not better, but we need to create mechanisms that can do this sort of thing. And we're not the first people to do emergency assistance to a crisis situation. There are models for this. It's been done before. So we need to start learning from those. And things like the talent mechanism are great. How quickly can they be spun up? And within all the members, who's got facilities that can do things at very short notice? That's really, really important. And I think, as a program manager, I'll come at that from a kind of procurement angle and say, we have to be putting contracts out with companies pre something going wrong. So we're saying to them, these are the rough scope of things you can do. Get yourself in there as quickly as you can and work like that. So I think my biggest takeaway is, what are the capabilities that sit in the member nations? And we need to do more to make sure that when crises do happen, we have things that can spin up on and off quickly and not wait till something bad happens to do it.
Tanel, please.
I
choose one of the 5.
Yes, I'll choose
you
one
can
of,
give
one of
out
Luke's lessons. Look, my job or my diplomatic career has taken me also to some other hot countries like Afghanistan or Ethiopia, and I've been dealing with some of these issues also elsewhere. There's always been this question amongst donors, or the discussion, how to improve donor coordination. Every single crisis. And it's really recurring. Now, telemechanism, IT coalition, I think we're really trying to make the difference. And this is the biggest thing. I mean, and I know that we're going to make plenty of mistakes on the road. But I, at the same time, I do believe that we're moving in the right direction. And one of these more concrete learning moments for me was a couple of months ago when we started working on, we have this framework document, which is fairly detailed document on different procedures and so on. And I was also first looking at the document thinking, do we need it? So why do we need to have everything written down so in detailed way? But then I realized that actually my main partner on the Ukrainian side was a former IT businessman. Probably he knows better how to deal with the kind of cyber issues or IT issues in the longer term to really have a language written down that is more understandable for this crowd. Mm-hmm. That was kind of my learning moment that, hey, maybe I should trust this approach. And I did.
The fish should like the bait.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Iryna, please.
So actually before joining the MOD, just last year, I was working for the NATO office in Ukraine, so I'm privileged to be on both sides of this puzzle, on the supporting side and on the receiving end now. So what I think matters from the beneficiary perspective is that you shouldn't come to your partners with and assume that they have previous knowledge of who you are, what you need, and the multitude of stakeholders that we have, for instance, in Ukraine. So you always need to be transparent and open as much as possible, because I think the challenge was back in 2017 when I joined NATO, that Ukraine still was quite a closed society, I would say. We don't want to talk about our mistakes and we don't want to air our dirty laundry. But I think that's where the situation needs to change and where other nations could learn that if you are open about your challenges, about your the problems you face, the gaps you face, your partners become part of your cause and understand what you face, and then they are more supportive and clearly understand how their support will impact. So that's what I would take away from this.
Heli.
I think what we have taken away is that it is very good and easy to work with Ukraine because we have a very good partner. The Ministry of Defense, Vice Minister Katerina Chernohorenko, Iryna is absolutely the golden person there who knows everything, who knows the Ukrainian system, who can reach quickly out to everybody, so on. So it works very smoothly and very well. But it's also because we have still a very small group of people. Mm-hmm. So it would be like, I don't know, 2 Estonians, 1 Luxembourgish, and then a couple of Ukrainians. So it is quite a lot what we have achieved with such a small manpower. We in Estonia are used to it. But of course, we also understand that if you scale it up and you suddenly have bigger groups and more coordination and maybe more partners, then it is getting more difficult. So I think that's one of the stages what the IT coalition needs to at some point grow to. And what we get out from the IT coalition, what we have learned is this amazing agile adaptation that has happened on the battlefield during the war. And honestly, I think all NATO nations, including the very capable ones, are happy to learn from Ukraine. So, and this is what we are doing as well. Every time we meet, we also are very happy to listen to the Ukrainian best practices and see the demos and different explanations how they have built all these systems. And I think it will be a very good lesson for NATO nations ourselves, because probably it's, the joke goes like Ukraine would like to join NATO, but I think also the joke goes the other way. NATO probably also would like to join Ukraine when it comes to actual experience in the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Adam.
So I'm quite new in the subject of cybersecurity. And even in Poland, when you can see on television, media, that people seem to be used to this war. But when I joined my current team in Ministry of Digital Affairs in Poland, I learned, I've seen that we are still capable of helping. That such initiatives like Tallinn mechanism is very complex, but needed aid.
Okay. Joseph.
Difficult to pick one of 5 when we've already gone through 5. I think I'd probably say in terms of the ability for these mechanisms to work, having the proactive and preventative approach in anticipation of crises is key. So there's the aspect that Luke pointed to with regards to having pre-existing mechanisms, but there's also things that have been alluded to with regards to building up a trusted relationship. Crucially, I think if there is a strong expectation that a country has a prominent adversary who is likely to conduct a significant attack and we would like to help, there needs to be a legal framework in place in advance to, for example, share information where assistance to be provided in that way. There needs to be understanding in place, as Iryna mentioned, towards the way that the domestic ecosystem works, where and how are we going to be trying to channel support. And so having those existing trusts, processes, and understandings are very important to making these things work. I think when we think about the IT coalition and Tallinn mechanism, and in the case that they have reached their maturity into 2023, a year following the war's inception, it reflects the fact that of some of the work that theoretically, that was happening before the invasion, but then just needed to be finished a little bit more to be able to have the confidence and capability to establish these processes.
I must personally say one of the learnings that I had is how much better it is to create a mechanism with a long-term perspective and across different fields of support than just one and off events and measures and projects. So I think this is really the gist of the Tallinn Mechanism and IT Coalition, that we're actually not speaking about a project, but rather about really a long-term perspective. Now it's time for the audience to come in with your questions. We have a microphone, and there is a lady up here who would like to kick us off.
Thank you very much, and very informative panel. I have a question, because I do think that it's extremely important to have public-private partnerships. And I'm mildly curious to know how many of you have heard about the Global NOG Alliance, where the first task force was Keep Ukraine Connected. And these are colleagues of mine that in March 22, a few weeks after the main war started, actually reached out. These are operational folks from Slovenia, from the Netherlands, from Germany, who reached out globally to say who can donate equipment, who can donate splicers, because if a bomb takes out your infrastructure, right, it's got to be fixed. And so they've been working for 2 years to do this, and they're working with the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Ukraine and Ukrainian Internet Association. So I am wondering, I mean, with this effort, I can see efforts like those, right? It would be a perfect partnership, and potentially others as well.
Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Medika Keio. I have US and Estonian citizenship and have been doing cybersecurity and infrastructure for about 30 years.
Okay. So who would like to take this question?
Could you repeat the group? Sorry, I didn't
Exactly.
quite get it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Please use the microphone.
And it started with Ukraine, and if you look, Keep Ukraine Connected, you'll find them.
Please repeat once again the name of the group.
The Global NOG Alliance, because they realized that it's not just going to be for Ukraine, but potentially longevity for actually getting the infrastructures fixed if there is any kind of wars in other regions.
Mm-hmm. So has anybody on the panel heard or worked with this organization?
From MOD side, no. Haven't heard. Maybe my colleagues in the audience have. I haven't. But as you said, they are mostly, I think, focusing on the civilian side of things, based on what you've explained. But what we discussed with Heli already, that we need to be indeed flexible in terms of how we engage support. And we also need to look into potential private funding, NGO funding, because if we talk about commercial off-the-shelf solutions, that it doesn't really matter who provide those, as long as they are willing to support Ukraine and share our cause, etc. What we had, though, is, for instance, in the case with Latvia, there is an NGO of Entrepreneurs for Peace, if I'm not mistaken. I can be wrong with the name, but they did donate, their 2 industry companies donated some IT equipment to us in support of the Ministry of Defense. So in terms of MOD, we are open to any sort of vehicles that would support us. And yeah, unfortunately, we haven't heard, but we will be happy to look into that.
We have General Alexander Putti here with us. He is Deputy Head of Triple SDAP in Ukraine. Perhaps you can add something on that.
Thank you. Yes, anything company from anything country can donate and can help Ukraine. We don't have any strong criteria, but we have a different mechanism how company can support Ukraine all of Ukraine, or maybe different institutions. For example, if you say about SSIP, we work together with different companies, Mandiant, for example, Google, Amazon, and Asset, and so on. We have a memo between institution SSIP and this company, and we get a service and another help. Another mechanism. This is mechanism United 24. This is mechanism for donate. donate can do company, physical and juridical company, and after this donate used for different project into Ukraine. And next, for example, when a country maybe and non-government organization like SUSAID and GIZ and FIAP, for example, organize a big project this into Ukraine in different sphere, military and civilian sphere. A company from another country can take part in this project after the concourse who organized this NGO and help Ukraine. And for example, we have a good mechanism and example from FCD from United Kingdom, when Ministry of Foreign Affairs from United Kingdom budgeting work British company buy a system in Ukraine, and this company organized a big project in different sphere, in cybersecurity sphere, on critical infrastructure protection, and so on. So today we have a different mechanism how support in Ukraine during this hard time for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, here, please.
I've been told I don't need a microphone, but I'll...
But we are recording your participation.
Todd Spires from CRDF Global. Have worked closely with a number of the panelists. A question for, to address something that both Luke and Ambassador Sepp had mentioned. Luke, you talked about the panic and hoping that the next guy doesn't have that, or gal. And Ambassador Sepp, you talked about the next crisis. It seems like in cyber defense assistance and the cyber capacity support, the hard part is knowing when it's time for a mechanism, and you've gone from the development arm of USAID, for instance, doing a long-term capacity building project. It seems like it's particularly difficult to draw a line in the sand because you don't want the adversary exploitation that Joseph talked about. How do you, does it really come down to, I can't define it, but I'll know it when I see it? Because it's also unlikely that the next crisis may be so black and white in terms of the nature of the conflict.
Do you want to start?
You want to start? I think it's a tough question, and it's a tough because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know how our efforts within Telemechanism, Mighty Coalition, how this will look like tomorrow. We have the vision for the future, and in a way, I've described the Telemechanism journey as a kind of building a startup. That with a big vision, we start doing things, and we do screw up some things, but we move on towards the vision. Now, is that concrete vision compatible to any crisis for the future? I'm not sure. But I do believe that there are some basic elements that we have figured out now that can be used also for the future conflicts. When exactly we should start implementing this, really, I do not know yet.
You set me up with that, thank you. No screw-ups on my side, thank you very much as well. Todd, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. I'm scribbling notes frantically. It's a question about thresholds, right? So when are those lines coming in? And it's actually, I think it's in your paper, Joe, if you read the full version, so go do that. But from my perspective, I think the biggest element that's going to be a challenge of it is political clarity. But I also think it's on us to build it, and they will come. So you saying, well, when you see it, if we don't put these things up as important and say to our seniors, hey, you've got this capability now, we can go get involved in these situations, the threshold conversation is going to be a strange one to have. You're not going to say, well, when should we look into doing that if you don't have anything to do for it? So it's a little bit horse and cart. So my mind is invested at the moment on just building the capability first so that people can make those decisions about thresholds. But we are doing that, and we have had some early conversations about where they come in. So I think some obvious ones are, any conflict where we have a stake. We might want to go, even if it's something we don't want to be overly involved in and overcommit to, we might say, well, we're going to go help out civil society and NGOs, and we're going to provide them cyber incident response support. Or we can go larger and say, we're going to help the military with cyber incident response support. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. For me, the eventual political clarity is going to be the most difficult and important thing to deciding where to go in and how to do that.
Tanel has an afterthought, and then Joseph.
Yes, I was just thinking that it also needs maturity from politicians. Especially from the recipient country. I mean, us, the donors, we want to give all kinds of assistance. But if Ukraine was not ready, if Ukraine was not mature enough to really start tackling digital cyber issues and ask for assistance for this, then we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, indeed.
Can I come back to that, Regine? Sorry, that's a really good...
you don't need a moderator, you can just...
Yeah, thank you. Organic panel. I want to say in Joe's paper as well, something that you discussed I thought was really interesting is you talk about the concept of cyber capacity building and cyber capability support. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the role. There's always loads of focus in the world of cyber. Well, there's not much evidence for it so far, but in my experience, there's a real excitement around cyber capabilities building support because we're going to stop these actors and we're going to respond to these adversaries. And cyber capacity building gets less attention. But without the cyber capacity building efforts that were ongoing, the kind of roads and the networks and the people we know and the skills they have aren't there. So how these two things pair is of the utmost importance. And that's why in the talent mechanism, we have 3 lines of effort. It's not this group is just for getting tech to Ukraine. It's what skills can we leave with Ukraine? What businesses can we incentivize to move to Ukraine and do more in Ukraine? It's also got a midterm point, which is if we build your SOC, will you start taking on the licenses yourselves? Can we help you with models and processes that help you build a kind of not fully uber mature SOC, but something in the middle? And then we've got the short-term stuff that we've spoken a lot about today. So it's a really great point in your paper.
Yeah.
I think...
Please make your own point.
No, I don't need to. It's wonderful. I think looping back to the original question you asked, Todd, with regards to, let's say, thresholds for deployment, I think that there's a lot of use in thinking about it in the IT coalition and Tallinn mechanism context, but that limits us to the remit of these activities or the remit of these mechanisms, which is explicitly Ukraine, whether that be civilian or military. As such, it makes it slightly more difficult to consider the broader question about, okay, if we're thinking about Moldova, if we're thinking about Taiwan, if we're thinking about other Pacific Island countries. And I think in that context, we then need to start broadening our analysis, and which is why I bring in multiple other mechanisms to think about, okay, how are we standardizing this? Think about the counter-ransomware initiative. There is, I don't know if it was deliberate, but there is a commitment within that to provide instant response where a country is targeted and has its core civilian functions disrupted by ransomware. There is also, under the Cyber Rapid, as in Australia's initiative I mentioned earlier, a commitment to protect any Indo-Pacific or any Pacific Island country. Papua New Guinea is a member of counter-ransomware initiative. It's also a relevant Pacific Island country. There's an overlap there. That could be a positive strategic overlap. Trying to trace and understand how all of these mechanisms are setting their remits and their thresholds for deployment within these remits is fundamentally important. I completely agree with you. And I think, as Luke referenced, there's a political function which will inevitably come in, where if people want to mobilize resources who have sufficient power, they will do so. And I think there's also a counterbalancing thing around, do we need to put technical checks around that to ensure that the mission creep doesn't get extraordinary and we spend all our money doing that, rather than some of the important work that was discussed by all members of the panel about building that initial trust, building the cyber capacity building in the longer term. So watch the other mechanisms, because they might be less well run, because the people on this panel are obviously running Tallinn and IT very well, but they are also trying to spin things up.
Heli, would you like to add to the threshold question?
Well, I think it's for us it's.
Do we need to formalize it?
Yeah.
That was also.
For us, it's very clear. It's the wartime situation, and then after the war is over, then it's another situation. Let's put it that way. It's like black and white almost.
There's a really interesting point, I think, there with regards to threshold for withdrawal as well, because my understanding from states' perspectives is a reluctance to get involved unnecessarily for the long term because it doesn't benefit anyone. And so how do we structure that in a way that's also reliable?
Because if the country is in the war, then it's like a country, like it's a car that is running with 200 kilometers per hour. And then you also want to somehow, change the wheels and fix it. I think that's where we are a bit like.
It's a withdrawal.
But once the war has stopped, the car doesn't have to speed up all the time.
I know the two of you want to say something. But the withdrawal question I would like to put also to Iryna.
Yeah, exactly.
What is your perspective on withdrawal of the assistance?
So from our end, I would hope that eventually all of these initiatives, definitely that are built around Ukraine, would grow into partnerships. So I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end all the time. I would want for this to mature enough that it is a two-way conversation, it is equal partnership, and actually the partnerships that aligned, geopolitically alike nations or nations of mutual interest that could assist each other, not just Ukraine, but built around mutual goals and objectives. And I would encourage, nations who are at potential risks to already think about putting similar frameworks in place, even if it's more about coordination or consultancy or expertise sharing at this point, but it's already to have that trust and partnership built before, rather than end up in a situation like we have ended up in. Because I think that Ukraine had lost some time and could have put a lot more effort earlier to avoid some of the challenges that we faced at the beginning of the war.
Tanel, please.
I wanted to add additional elements here in terms of the thresholds. And this really relates to the private sector. And an interesting thing that what has happened now is that you had some of these companies giving pro bono assistance to Ukraine. And then us, the governments, at one point we were seeing that, okay, the companies are stopping pro bono assistance, but then now the question is about the expectations. And the logic that we were also kind of wondering, what is the logic in the boardroom of one company to decide that, okay, now some conditions are met, that no more pro bono assistance, and what happens then? Do the donors have to pick up the bill? It would be difficult for me to argue to my minister, for example, this. So there are different questions here, and it kind of relates to the threshold thing.
Luke, please.
I'm conscious of the need for more questions, so I'll keep this quick and won't ask questions back. But from my perspective as well, Heli, I think something interesting to think about, we've kind of got the same formalization you've talked about there, which is when the war ends, kind of requires a sort of slight rethink, right, or an adjustment mentally. But I think there's a lack of evidence for what the cyber conflict looks like when the war ends and how that goes. And, persistent engagement theory, to reference it, is this really just going to continue elsewhere? Will these things get distracted?
But we are dealing with more than just cyber. So that's why for us, I think war is more like a threshold.
Very much so. And that makes a lot of sense in that context. The other thing I wanted to say as well, though, I think there might be a sort of natural turning point as well, one that perhaps hasn't been considered, which is if there's another crisis of anywhere near this scale, my concern is the people with the skills who've experienced it over here will potentially get moved to over here because they have this thing. And that's the same for the private companies. They've got people who've worked in this conflict. And one of my concerns for Ukraine, perhaps, is if something flares up elsewhere in the world, what happens to those people that have spent a lot of time building partnerships in Ukraine? Do they get moved because of their experience there? And that is of concern to me.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, there is a question there. Yeah.
Matthias Krempel, German Cyber Reserve. We realize that there were two types of what you could call an international levée en masse. The one was the Ukrainian cyber army, which was launched via two Telegram channels from Ukraine, and the other one was a grassroots organization which still exists. I think its name is NAFO. Did that prove to have an effect, or was that just an initiative of the first hours?
So that is a question to Iryna and then Heli, perhaps?
I can comment, but Iryna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy to comment, but of course, colleagues in the audience also feel free to jump in on this one. So I think with the advanced, adversary we are dealing in many cases, these sort of grassroots initiatives, as you mentioned, indeed have been an urgent response, and I think we need to look into, and I think the discussions are already ongoing on how we formalize this sort of cooperation with civil society, with individuals, so at least they don't get in jail for what they've done, but overall, so that we have this flexible mechanism in place for the future if there is a need to resort to this sort of urgent response. But I think we cannot proceed without a capable cyber force in Ukraine and capable civilian organizations that can protect their infrastructure. So I think there should be a synergy there, but I wouldn't rely on the initiatives that you mentioned as a go-to mechanism for responding to this sort of crisis.
Heli, please.
Yeah, it's always useful to use this kind of energy that in the beginning of crisis is creating, but at some point it has to be structured and systematic response. And it's not useful always to rely on volunteers when you need to have structured, systematic response. But not, of course, saying that volunteers are not useful. They are very useful, yes.
Okay, where's our mic? Here, please, here. Second row.
Thank you. I'm not actually asking a question, I'm making a comment, as Iryna said.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Alexei Kachenko. I represent National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, National Cybersecurity Council, and answering your question about the IT groups, so to say, they proved very useful, and this was definitely not the initiative of the first hours. We were not so in panic that just need them for just first hours, because we set up in Ukraine, by we I mean the country, of course, Ukraine. So we set a lot of public-private cooperation, and answering previous questions, please don't think that public-private cooperation between government and IT in Ukraine is dead because of the war. It's not. There are a lot of developments, there are a lot of applications done. Well, one of the last one is Cyber Brahma, who is the application which is focused on the counteracting to cybercrime and cyber attacks. There are a number of IT groups working for us, and as Iryna correctly said, we need now, the government of Ukraine is now in discussion of how to formalize those people in order to let them avoid the Russian-focused prosecution, which they already had started to do, because they have already started to put things into international courts or Interpol for our people who are working for government of Ukraine, but say not for the so to say officially. Chatham rules, of course, applied. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? There's one back.
Hi, Commander Recamarosi from UK MOD. When I hear you talk about the need for coordination capabilities for future crises, the badly repressed NATO staff officer inside me thinks immediately of stabilization operations. Perhaps we need a new standing contingency mechanism, and why not maybe an extra working group? Is there a role for NATO in all this, or should we leave it to coalitions of diplomats and aid professionals?
Is that one for me?
Yeah, that is for you.
Okay, great. It's a hard question to answer, and I can only kind of speak from my experience, is that I think there's room for something like the FCDO to do this. When we look at the international elements of it, it rests slightly comfortably. But there's lots of questions, when we started the Ukraine program about who needed to be in the team. Do we have to have an NCSC person from the National Cybersecurity Centre to advise us? Do we need someone from UK MOD to make sure that everything you guys do is mapped to what we do? So I hear what you're saying, and there's this concern about, does it get too multiplicitous and out of control? So I guess I could go into more detail about what I think we're going to try propose from FCDO, and then at some point we've got plenty of room to have a private conversation and you tell me I'm wrong. But we're looking into bringing lots of industry partners together. One thing Ukraine taught us was that need to be able to surge, and that ability to do that sits in industry. So we can contract the services, we can surge lots of support to one specific area. And in my head, it's kind of like a spider's web with multiple spiders living on it. Something goes off over here and we all swarm to it. Kind of scary for those with arachnophobia. But yeah, so that's what we want to do with private industry. But do I think there are roles for different government departments in the UK? US have things like hunt forward operations. Yes. So I think this whole thing can exist together, and how it comes together, people, you and I, might get to decide.
If I can add to this, I think it's interesting that with Ukraine, cyber capacity building in a lot of foreign ministries gained relevance. Also, in our case, funds increased. So it really highlighted also the existence of cyber diplomacy in this whole field. Tanel, please.
I think that one of the critical notions here is that right now the war in Ukraine is the first one where really cyber is fully integrated into normal warfare. And we have not seen cyber in such a prominent role before, and in such a large scale. So do we need additional working group on this? I'm not sure. But at the same time, we also do not know today what will happen, for example, when with the additional artillery, Ukraine advances, Russia starts losing, and then what would be the reaction then? Will you see more kind of hybrid or cyber attacks that some analysts are saying could happen? What will be the consequences then? I would wait a bit before establishing a new working group, just to see what are the true lessons actually from this. Some of these lessons we cannot predict today.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Do we have one?
If we don't, Regine, can I? Oh,
yeah.
Well, on the NATO point that was made briefly as well.
Okay, please.
I think it's worth highlighting that there is an attempt to make something like that within NATO with the virtual cyber incident support capability, and there are long-standing. There was an attempt, I don't know where it went, but it's documented, of cyber rapid response team type entities within NATO. I don't know how they function, I don't know why they work or they don't work, as we could see in the case of Albania. And I think that, the merits or demerits of a working group aside, if there is movement and momentum to try to establish this kind of, let's say, mechanism already within, as I said, the VCISC, we do probably need to think a little bit more actively around taking the learnings from IT Coalition, from Tallinn, and applying them in this context. And that also stands for the European political community's attempt to do the cyber reserve, and an understanding of how we deconflict these, if at all, or if we're going to benefit from the strategic overlap.
Heli, please.
I actually would agree with Tanel that we really need to probably absorb those lessons properly and see what kind of mechanisms and functions we miss in NATO and EU before setting up another working group. We have plenty of those. So the question would be, what's the function? What we are trying to achieve and how we achieve it. So probably need to have some reflection time.
Luke wanted to say something.
It's kind of a question for Iryna on the back of that question.
Yeah.
Two questions, Iryna. I don't know if you've got a notepad, but so my first one for you is do you care who you work with or just how many people you work with? Because I think that's the question there of working groups. The more things we form, the more things you have to engage with. Mm-hmm. So do you care about the number or who? With me, you're often engaging with FCDO, but you might work with other countries' MOD because they happen to house the program. That's my first one. And my second one is, you mentioned earlier that there's a kind of cognitive dissonance around success on the battlefield and cyber. And I think it's time for a rethinking of that. I know a lot of analysts took a lot out the early stages of the war, and there were some very public attacks that became common knowledge. But I think that there's now too much analysis on that and not enough of a focus of how is Russia using cyber in Ukraine now, for what effect is it doing so. And I think there's strong evidence of the fact the front line is where it is partly because of cyber, and that's really important to consider. So my question to you is, do you feel that your leadership understand how linked cyber is to the battlefield?
Oh, I'll get fired for the answer. So back to your first point. Overall, I think that was the exact reason that we established these coordination mechanisms, that we don't have to talk to each partner separately and repeat the same information multiple times. Although I still understand that there are, multiple levels of conversation. We can present all of our requirements, and then if partner is interested, we can have a more detailed coordination or engagement. So from that perspective, I think the leaner the structure we have, the better, for the benefit of both of us, those supporting us and Ukraine. And yeah, we don't want over-coordinate. I feel like, when the Russian troops left some of the regions of Kyiv, we started to feel this coordination fatigue a bit, because all of a sudden people wanted to spend more time discussing rather than doing. So I would still focus on quick, flexible ways of supporting us, or anyone for that matter, in terms of cooperation frameworks. So yes, when we hear of additional potential vehicles, platform from NATO, from anywhere else, we always ask the question critically, so how will it fit in the existing frameworks, and do we need that one, or can you please be part of the existing formats? And I think that's where the work with the lead nations also helps a lot, because they spend a lot more time than some other nations to understand Ukraine truly, and to understand our requirements. So sometimes they are very helpful in doing our job for us while advocating our requirements, explaining who we are and what we need. So that is also, I think, key. In terms of understanding, cyber and the role of it on the battlefield, I think there is still, an opportunity for Ukraine to fully integrate cyber considerations in our operational planning and how we conduct operations. And I think we are starting to understand that indeed, this is the asymmetric advantage that we could use, because we may not necessarily have enough artillery and other hardware, but our skills, our expertise in IT and cyber domain is where we could actually outpace the enemy. So I hope that our leadership will continue to pursue this path. Definitely, our Deputy Minister is very keen to digitize the armed forces, to have digital army and digital savvy soldiers. That's quite difficult, because all of them come from very different backgrounds and very different previous knowledge and expertise. But we understand that we cannot think of fighting Russia in the traditional way, in the traditional warfare perspective.
Thank you. Quick question, last question. In the meantime, I can perhaps add that, from a deep state perspective, civil servant perspective, everybody sees the need to coordinate with others. Nobody wants to be coordinated by an organization. So please, your question.
Thank you. I'm John Marquis from Mandiant. So I've been privileged to lead Mandiant's effort in Ukraine for the last 2 years, since day one of the war. So I've seen these coalitions be formed during that time, and the partnership with FCDO has been fantastic, and representatives of your countries as well. Lots in this really great discussion. Really good to have that open discussion as well. lots about the use of the private sector and industry and that support and agility. So my question to all the panel is, what more can the private sector do to help Ukraine? What more can we be doing?
Yeah, a question to Iryna and then perhaps others to comment.
First of all, what I would like to ask of industry overall is to stop competing with each other. You can only, bring success if you are building on each other's strengths and opportunities that we have in Ukraine. So what we also are sort of getting tired of is, multiple industry partners approaching us, asking us to send letters of request to the governments to sponsor their services. And in some cases, it's actually successful. And then our partners are running around figuring out who does it need and why you need this and do you really need this. So I think what Luke outlined earlier during the conversation is that industry could be that helping hand in country for government partners to better scope the requirements, because sometimes our partners, again, do not necessarily have enough technology background and do not necessarily have a good understanding on how certain capabilities should be implemented, because it is not just plug and play in some cases. So that's where your expertise could contribute to make sure that indeed the support is not just shopping lists and delivering stuff to Ukraine, but it is sustainable and we clearly understand the outcomes, the total cost of ownership, and life cycle of these capabilities.
Thank you. So we used part of your coffee break already, but with permission of the organizers. So thank you for your participation, and please give a round of applause to our panelists.